Hi, we're back.
Thank
you for staying with us. You listen to Planet Green Trees. I'm your host, Michael Korn. Call numbers 1-347-326-9626. Next, very, very excited to have on Dr. Bearman. Dr. Bearman has been active in the clinical practice of cannabinoid medicine for 12 years. He's one of the founders and vice president of the American Academy Cannabinoid Medicine. He has a regular column on the American Alliance of Cannabis Medicine. That's his website. His articles have appeared in O'Shaughnessy's, Cannabis Times, and the West Coast Leaf. He's featured in many documentaries, one of which is What If Cannabis Cured Cancer and Medicinal Cannabis and Your Health. He's testified as an expert witness for 400 criminal and civil cases involving psychoactive drugs. And he was awarded the coveted Peter McWilliams Memorial Award by NORML. So, without any more further ado, Dr. Bearman, thank you very much for joining us, sir.
My pleasure to be here.
You know, we are, as you know, but we're going through a lot of what many other states have gone through in the implementation of a initiative, and maybe you may have heard some of the things we're, kicking off some legislative hearings, and really the first time.
Not at all too familiar.
You got any suggestions just out of the gate before we get into the medical side? And we're also fascinated to hear about this, but what are your thoughts? I mean, you've been here and seen that. What kind of suggestions would you have as we go forward?
Well, I think that involving LEAP, law enforcement against prohibition, is always a good idea. I think that you'd be surprised at how many allies you have in the straight medical community, and I'm not talking about the physicians that practice minimalist medicine. Also, I used to be the director of health services at San Diego State, and I worked with the disabled students there, and they had a tactic that they called flashing iron, which meant that they got everybody together that had a wheelchair or a cane or crutches, and they'd bring them in to testify on, say, access for the disabled. So I think that those are some things that you can do. The other thing that you might look at is, can you put together a video that will go up on YouTube that might be good enough that it could go viral? And if you had a little dough, it would be nice to have a 15-second or 30-second commercial dealing with the most important issues. So, and the other thing that I think it's important, I am a physician, is I'd lean on the American Medical Association. They said that cannabis should be rescheduled. I'd lean on the decision made by the DEA, the Chief Administrative Law Judge in 1988, who recommended that cannabis be rescheduled. I think that rescheduling is something that you ought to lean heavily on, because that would solve most of the problems. It would turn dispensaries into pharmacies. They'd have to follow pharmacy law. The other thing, I tend to be facetious and satirical. I would complain that the Michigan legislature isn't conservative enough, and that they should be conservative like Ron Paul, and that if they take a look at the Gonzalez versus Raich decision, who dissented? It was Rehnquist, Thomas, and Sandra Day O'Connor. None of them have been confused for being a liberal. And so I think that pushing the unexpected, pushing the fact that you want more conservative thought on this. I also think that encouraging your folks, if they can register as Republicans, to vote for Ron Paul in the primary, because Paul is so right on this particular issue, and Paul is making sense as a conservative. I'm not a conservative, by the way, and I probably wouldn't vote for Paul, but I think that it's not a bad tactic.
There's even more important reason, because our Attorney General is Mitt Romney's campaign chairman in Michigan, and is probably set to have designed some kind of position should Romney get the nomination. And if any vote against Romney is a vote against our Attorney General, who's just been out to destroy the implementation of the law. But we are well aware of voting for, Yes, you're going, because it's a primary. It's open to anyone. In fact, let me announce that it's February 28th is the Republican primary, open to everybody. And a vote for anyone other than Mitt Romney is a vote against Bill Schuette. So anyone can go vote. So go vote. And vote for someone other than Mitt Romney or Ron Paul. Let's get it out for Ron Paul. Absolutely. And returning to this other issue, and I just, you're right about hitting them with the conservative. In fact, when they realize that the Michigan, any of these referendums are states' rights issues,
absolutely.
They're like, wait a second. We put it in that context because this is their traditional mantra as they fight for Arizona to be able to enact its own immigration law. They won't fight for a referendum enacted by their own kind of medical issue. But
indeed, the 9th and 10th Amendment to the Constitution are states' rights amendments. There's a new kind of satirical line: states' rights isn't just for racists anymore. And there's a 1925 U.S. Supreme Court decision called the Lindner decision, which ruled that the federal government has no constitutional authority to regulate the practice of medicine. That is the state's authority. And if you read O'Connor's and Thomas's dissent in Gonzalez versus Raich, they took a states' rights position. Rehnquist joined O'Connor in her dissent. And what's happening here is the government is sticking their nose into people's private health interests. And the precedent here is chilling, and you guys have correctly identified that. The patient is entitled to doctor-patient privacy, and we have had cannabis available in pharmacies in this country from 1854 to 1942. My father was a pharmacist. He started being a pharmacist in 1928 because millions of prescriptions were written during that time period that contained cannabis. There's no doubt in my mind that my father filled several prescriptions that had cannabis. Take a look at what was going on in the 1920s and 1930s. You could get cannabis in prescriptions, you could get cannabis over the counter, and you could smoke cannabis, and it wasn't illegal, and the country wasn't going to hell in a handbasket. What was causing it to go to hell in a handbasket was alcohol prohibition. That was one of the things that was contributing to it. The other thing that you guys might bring up that has nothing to do with medicine is that the Marijuana Tax Act, which was heavily testified against by the American Medical Association, was clearly not about medicine. It was about hemp. And it was about the competition that hemp would bring to the petrochemical industry. Remember that DuPont had the patents for nylon. They had the rights to the patent for rayon. They made tetraethyl lead, and they made the sulfites that were used to make paper out of both wood pulp and hemp, except that you had to use 4 times as much to make paper out of wood pulp as you did to make it out of hemp. Furthermore, DuPont was a majority stockholder in General Motors, and they were concerned about Ford, who had developed a car made largely out of hemp that ran on hemp. And who wrote the Marijuana Tax Act? Lamont DuPont wrote the Marijuana Tax Act. And we have to recognize that Hearst and Anslinger were bit players, and it was DuPont who was out in front. And I suggest that anybody that wants to see intelligent medical comment should read the testimony of Dr. William C. Woodward, who was the chief legal consultant for the AMA, and I will shut up and let you ask a question here.
No, I've read that. That is very compelling. He could, first of all, no one knew that they were talking about because they called it cannabis, and they also began to call it marijuana. And he was like, "What are you doing? You're taking medicine away from people, and you have no basis to do it." And they told him, "Listen, this is where we're going. Get on board, and if you're not showing up with some legislation to cure the problem, then go away," or something like that. Which is kind of
exactly.
We're facing the same thing today when we try to speak to the legislature. What are you doing? Why don't you try to implement the law? They say, come with some legislation for us. We're like, you don't need to change the law. It needs to be implemented by the administrative agencies. All right, but I want to talk about this because we have specific conditions enumerated on our registry, none of which deal with any of the psychiatric or psychological conditions, as they say.
Right.
I've always said that if they allowed, and this is one of our big complaints is that the law, our act, says that upon a petition, an administrative committee has to be formed and hearings on new conditions. And nothing has happened in 4 years. This is one of our biggest complaints. But I've said, if they ever allow any of these conditions to get onto the registry, depression, anxiety, ADDH, the program would triple in number because so many people are currently using these, medications, prescription medications to treat these conditions, and it's frequent. Now, please tell us about your involvement in this aspect.
Well, one of the nice things about California was a clause that was added by Dr. Todd McArea, who was a real pioneer in this, that there's a list of designated conditions and symptoms, and then there's a catch-all that said, or any other medical condition for which the physician feels marijuana is useful in treating. And so while the number one reason we have for making recommendation is pain, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, and you've mentioned this earlier on the program, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think in terms of a strategy, that bringing in the many military men and women who suffer from PTSD and having them testify is really important. And don't forget that the state of New Mexico has PTSD as a specific designated condition. Furthermore, the Croatian Supreme Court, if you will, said it was okay for their soldiers to use cannabis to treat PTSD, and in Israel, they're under certain circumstances are allowed to treat PTSD with cannabis. And here you have people like Newt Gingrich, who says being the son of a military person is the same as being in the military. I'm not sure what dream he has, but they give lip service to our military and our veterans, and then they throw them in jail for using a medication that is extremely effective in treating post-traumatic stress disorder.